Good morning, Good Life family. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's online service. We are thankful to have you here, and we're excited to be continuing a series that we're in right now called Reclamation Projects. In addition to that, we also just want to either let you know, maybe for the very first time, or remind you what we're all about here as a church family. And that is to be a people who love enough to share in the good news of Jesus and to share our lives as well. This morning, we're going to be sharing in the good news through song and also through studying God's Word together. But before we get there, I quickly just want to give you a few ways that we can share life, and then we'll continue on and begin our service. So an easy way to share life with us as a church family is if you want to know more about our church or how you can get connected or maybe next steps in your faith following Jesus, then we would invite you to email us at info@goodlifefl.com, or you can visit our website, goodlifefl.com. In addition to that, you can always connect with us throughout the week on social media. We're on Facebook as well as Instagram. And a great way to share life is simply doing what you're doing right now. That you're remaining connected to the local church. And I do want to encourage you as well and let you know that you can also join us in person. We gather at 9:30 and 11, as well as these online services at 11 o'clock. So thank you again for joining us, and let's go ahead and begin our service, and let's start with worship.
Battle, you see my victory. When all I see is a mountain, you see a mountain move. And as I walk through the shadow, your love surrounds me. There's nothing to fear now, for I am safe in you. Oh, we sing. So when I fight on my knees with my hands lifted high. Oh God, the battle belongs to you, and every fear I lay at your feet. Yeah, I'll sing through the night. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. For if you are for me, who can be against me? Oh, there's nothing. For Jesus, there's nothing impossible. And when all I see are the ashes, you see the beauty. Think you gone on. And when all I see is the cross, God, you see the empty tomb. Oh, so when I will fight on my knees with my hands lifted high. The battle belongs to you, and every fear I lay at your feet, and I'll sing through the night. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. Oh, you're an almighty fortress, you go before us, and nothing can stand against the power of our God. You shine in the shadows, you win every battle. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. An almighty fortress, you go before us. That's right. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. You shine in the shadows, you win every battle. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. Oh, so when I fight on my knees with my hands lifted belongs to you. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. It belongs to you, Lord.
Christmas is almost here. Can you believe it's only 2 weeks away? Like, 'tis the season for decking the halls and dashing through the snow. Like, well, not so much here, but other places, I'm sure they're dashing through some snow. And 'tis the season at our house where on any given Sunday, one of the TVs will be tuned into football, and the other one, maybe ones, will be tuned into Hallmark Channel Christmas movies, right? While I'm watching the Bucks put me through like stress test on my heart, right? My wife is watching Hallmark Christmas movies. I don't get them, but she loves them, like absolutely loves them. And so whenever I catch a few minutes of one, I look at her and I go, like, haven't you seen this one? She goes, no, this one's brand new, totally different. I was like, but it seems like the same story as the other one. And it's not just the same story, it's actually the exact same actors. Like every time I walk through and it's on, Candace Cameron Bure, do you guys know who I'm talking about? Candace Cameron, you may know her from way back in the 80s and 90s, a show called Full House. She was DJ Tanner, the oldest daughter on Full House, and now she's in like literally 27 Hallmark movies, and a lot of them are Christmas Hallmark movies. She's in, catch this, Christmas Town. If I Only Had Christmas, and one of my personal favorites, A Shoe Addict's Christmas, like on the list of movies that Kel would watch. Okay, that's just below 2 hours of someone reading the yellow pages, right? A Shoe Addict's Christmas, it doesn't interest me. She's been in A Christmas Detour, Journey Back to Christmas, and then she played 2 roles in Switched for Christmas. How she didn't get the Emmy is beyond me. Like they really should do a recount on that one. She's been in Let It Snow. She's been in Christmas Under Wraps. And then my personal favorite, Moonlight and Mistletoe. When I heard it, I said, that is almost the perfect country music Christmas song, right? If it was Moonshine and Mistletoe, I'm telling you, Forrest, write the song, your Grammy is coming, right? I'd be willing to bet my wife has seen every single one of these. And in the next service, I'm going to be in trouble. So y'all pray for me that I'm poking fun at Hallmark Christmas movies. Like, she loves them. I don't get them, but she loves them. That's good enough for me. Because here's the thing. Who can really argue with a good love story? Today, we're actually going to be looking at an ancient love story. But it's a love story that looks nothing like a Hallmark Christmas movie. There's no gazebos at the center of the town square. There's no perfectly timed beginning of the snowfall when they have their first kiss, okay? And there's no uncommonly attractive people in ordinary run-of-the-mill jobs. This is not a Hallmark Christmas movie. As we continue our Reclamation Project series, we're going to be looking at a love story that involves a woman named Ruth. We're going to be looking at a story that is not different from our normal lives, although it's ancient. We're actually looking at a story that is incredibly ordinary. There's nothing miraculous that happens. There's no enormous moment where God shows up and does something that you never see coming, like breaks the supernatural laws and brings this miracle to bear in the story. It's just a common, ordinary, everyday story, but it's going to seem a little different to us because it's ancient. So if we read this story through a 21st century Hallmark Christmas movie lens of what romance is going to look like, it's going to seem very weird to us. So you got to take that and set that aside and just realize their customs are very different than our customs. An act of love for them is very different from an act of expressing love for us. And doing that, then I think this story will make a lot of sense to us, and I'll try and point those things out as we go along. But this story could not be more ordinary, and it actually begins with tragedy. A tragedy that when you read it, you get to the end of the tragedy and you go, well, clearly this isn't going to be somebody that God's going to use in some big way. This is not the beginning of a story where God's going to have this person be a huge part of his plan. But We might be wrong in that. Will you please join me in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, where it says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And they had 2 sons, were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab, and they remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. So these took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth, and they lived there for about 10 years. But both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband." This story starts with a tragedy. This is not the beginnings of a Hallmark movie, is it? It begins in tragedy of a famine happening in the land of Israel, a family facing a famine. And these 2 parents, they do their best to face the famine by moving to another country and making a home there where they knew that there was food. By the end of verse 5, this happy little family that once was husband and wife and 2 boys, this happy little family is actually down to just Naomi, the wife, and then the 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. It's down to just 3. This is not the beginning of some Hallmark Christmas movie. This is a story. It is going to end up being a love story, but a love story that begins in tragedy. When the dust settles from their loss, Naomi hears that food is now growing in Israel, back in her homeland. So she wants to go back to Bethlehem. And so she starts to go and leave, and she has conversations with her daughters-in-law saying, "I release you. You don't have to stay with me. I have no future where I'm going. I'm going to go back and try and make the best of it, but you don't have to come along with me. You guys can stay here. You're not from my country. You're not of my people. You are Moabites, and I'm an Israelite. Why don't you guys just go back to your homes, hit the reset button, and start life over?" And so the daughters-in-law, they protest, but Naomi insists, and eventually Orpah says, "Okay, I'll just go back home." And that brings us to verse 14, where it says, "Then they lifted up their voices, and they wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And Naomi said, 'See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law.' But Ruth said, 'Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you.' And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go, she said no more." Ruth saw her sister-in-law, Orpah. Eventually, she loved Naomi too. It isn't that Orpah was this bad person in the story. Orpah goes, "You know what? I know what home is like. I know the familiar confines of home. I know I can go back and hit the reset button there. I love Naomi, and I'm going to miss Naomi, but I'm going to head home." She's not the villain in the story. But Ruth makes this remarkable declaration of affection and commitment to her mother-in-law. You see, Orpah going back to the familiar, but Ruth doesn't want the familiar. She's found a family in Naomi. We don't know anything about Ruth's backstory, of the events and the situations and the relationships that led her to go, no. I choose Naomi and all that's unknown instead of going back to what I know. But we do know enough to know that she saw something in Naomi that made her want to stay. Why did Ruth want to stay with Naomi? Like, what's happening there? If we start to fill in some of the blanks and we take Ruth at her testimony, I think it's because Ruth saw that Naomi had something that Ruth was missing. She'd seen something in the heart of her mother-in-law, in her faith that she had brought from Israel to Moab. She saw something in there that she did not have. But we can't also miss the cultural context of what Ruth was actually facing, what Naomi was actually facing. We also know that Ruth had nowhere else to turn. If we walk through the culture and understand what's going on here, there's a lot that's happening that we need to understand in order to move forward in the story. Ruth knew she had nowhere else to turn. First off, she was a Moabite. Now, that doesn't mean a whole lot to us, but it meant that she grew up very far from God. It means she grew up in a culture where there was a religion that was the complete opposite of everything Israel valued. It really matters that she was a Moabite, not just because she was a Gentile. Now, a Gentile in biblical terms is anybody who's not a Jew, anybody who's not one of the people of Israel, God's chosen people. That meant you were an outsider looking in. And even though God did not intend it to be this way, the Israelites decided because God chose us, that must mean we're awesome and everyone else isn't. So they were looking down on the rest of the world. So there will be a lot of friction right from the get-go. But to know that she's a Moabite actually makes it worse than just being any old Gentile, because here's what we have to understand. The people of Moab came from the incestuous relationship between Lot and his oldest daughter when Sodom and Gomorrah fell. I know, like sometimes the Bible's like an episode of Jerry Springer, right? But this is really what happened. And the child of that union was called Moab, and the descendants of this guy become the Moabites. So the Israelites saw them as just worthless and dirty. We got to understand that, bringing that into the story. The second thing is this. Not only is she a Moabite, she's also widowed. Now, that doesn't mean anything negative about somebody who's a widow. What I'm saying is that this is how the culture would have viewed that situation. If you were a woman living in this patriarchal society, it meant not only have you experienced the pain of the loss of your spouse, but it meant now you are going to have to fend for yourself. It means you're on your own. Because a woman in this culture was unlikely to own land, unlikely to plant crops, unlikely to be able to provide for herself. Now, remember, we can't view this story from a 21st century perspective and go, well, I'm going to dismiss the story then. That'd be the wrong conclusion. We got to realize what the story meant to the original hearers and then bring it forward to us today. So for her, here you have these two widows heading back to a culture that was not necessarily favorable for widows. They're not going to go back like a Hallmark Christmas movie to the hometown, open a candle shop, and everything's going to go great, and by the end, they're kissing in the gazebo at the center of town when the snow starts to fall. That's not the prospects that they're walking toward. Here's the third thing. Ruth would have been a foreigner. Now, I also said she was a Moabite. This is a different thing. It meant she was a stranger in a strange land. It isn't just that she grew up far from God in a religion that was so pagan they would sacrifice humans to their gods. It isn't just that. It's that she is an outsider looking in. And the Moabites and the Israelites, they hated each other. This is the Hatfields and the McCoys. This is an ancient generational struggle and feud between these two. And she's going to live among the enemy. All that sets up the fact that Ruth had nowhere else to turn. But that brings us back to the first reason why Ruth went with Naomi. Why? Because she saw something in Naomi that she could not find at home. She said, not only am I going to go home with you, but your God's going to be my God, because I see something in you that I haven't seen anywhere else. I need some more of that. So far in our stories, the people we've looked at in these reclamation projects, they're not like Ruth. Ruth is very different from those people. We've looked at Peter and Thomas and Gideon and Jonah, people who either missed the moment or messed up their lives. Those are the stories that we've looked at. That's not who Ruth is. Ruth's story is different. Life happened to her. So far, her story doesn't sound like the makings of a Hallmark movie, but it also doesn't sound like the story of someone who has made a mess of their life and now God's going to bring them back. Life's made a mess of her. Like life has messed with her. But it's in this short story that I hope all of us can kind of see. There's only 85 verses in this entire book. But I hope it's within this story that all of us can see that Ruth's story is our story. And we're not Moabites, and we may not be widowed and all this. But what I want you to see is this, is that anybody who walked in today with a troubled past, a painful past, you're dealing with a loss, you're dealing with a setback, you're feeling like an outsider, you're doing your best in life to do the right thing, but you have no confidence or no assurance that everything's going to work out right in the end. If that's you, this story can speak to you right where you are. This ordinary, everyday story, while it's ancient in context, couldn't be more timely to your life and my life today. So let's get back to that story in verse 22 where it says, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. So here you have these two widows who have come to Israel, and they have no visible means of support. Ruth is willing to do whatever it takes to support her new family. So Ruth goes out into the fields during the harvest time. They come to Bethlehem during the harvest time. The fields are ripe for harvest. So the workers are going through the fields, cutting down the wheat, gathering everything together, and then bringing it in to process it. But as they're doing that, some stalks of grain will fall to the ground and fall to the ground and fall to the ground. So this gleaning, that word that we go, what's gleaning, right? What this is them grabbing up the scraps, poor people walking behind the harvesters, picking up the scraps in order to provide for themselves from what's there. That's what's happening here in the scene. So she's gleaning in the field, but she doesn't really know what field she's in. She happens on a field to the part of the field owned by a man named Boaz, and she starts to glean there. She starts to pick up things there. And that man Boaz was from the same clan as her husband and her father-in-law. So Boaz shows up later in the day. He comes in and he sees this woman that he does not know gleaning behind his work group. And as she's doing that, he comes up to the leader of his work team and says, "Who's this person?" And he says, "This is Ruth. She came back with Naomi. She asked if she could glean in the fields." We said, "Sure, go ahead." And he said, "She's been working nonstop all day." And so when they come back together, when Boaz hears that, he ends up interacting with Ruth a little bit later, and we see that in verse 8, where it says, "Then Boaz said to Ruth, 'Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this alone, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn.' Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, 'Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?' But Boaz answered her, 'All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.' Then she said, 'I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants.'" Here in this scene, through this ancient story, let's take a modern lens and glean what we can from it, right? Boaz is showing her uncommon kindness, providing for her provision, providing protection, and then offering for her a prayer, saying to her, "May God bless you for what you've done. I heard how you have treated Naomi, and I'm blown away by it. You have done an amazing thing in the eyes of God, and may God bless you and protect you because of that." He's being so kind because it's a little bit of a reveal of his character in the way he's handling her. He did not have to do that. This is a stranger picking up food in his field. He didn't have to treat her kindly, but it shows his character. And yet, we also see that it's a response to Ruth's kindness to Naomi, and that's why he's doing what he's doing. And we see in Ruth here something really important. When life takes a hard left turn and you find yourself in a ditch, sometimes we really don't know what to do we? When that happens, it's like, I didn't sign up for this. I didn't see this coming. I really don't know what to do. Ruth was not signing up for marrying this guy who would eventually die and then landing in a land she'd never seen before among a people who hated her people. That wasn't what she wanted to do, but what did Ruth keep doing? What can we learn from this model that the story of Ruth is providing? Here's this. When her story didn't make any sense, Ruth kept doing the next right thing. So many times in our lives, things go wrong, and we go, well, until I make sense of this, I'm done, I'm checking out, I don't know what to do. No, Ruth did not end up here and go, when I sort out all my life, then I'll be able to start getting things together. Like, Naomi, what's for lunch? No, Ruth said, I'm going to go do the next right thing. I'm going to go provide as best I can and do the next right thing, and we should do the same thing. When life doesn't make sense, we already know the things God has told us to do. He says to love him with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. He told us to do everything as unto the Lord, as if you're working for the Lord Christ. He's told us to do all those things. He's told us to be a people who not only love God and love others, but love enough to share the good news. Like, we already have all these things that God has already told us to do. But when life takes that left turn and we find ourselves in the ditch, right, and the airbag's gone off and we don't know what to do, like things have just gone wrong in our lives, we go, once I sort this all out, then I'll get back serving God. And I think that's the exact wrong way to look at it. When we have no idea what else to do, let's do the last thing God said. And let's keep being faithful to that. You don't need to sort out your story before you're obedient. You just need to keep pursuing the one who's writing it. Oh, how different our lives would be when a speed bump comes or maybe a huge crash. If we said, God, I don't get it, I don't understand it, but I'm going to keep pursuing you because I know you are the one who control my story. At mealtime comes, they have a meal break, and Boaz invites Ruth to eat with his work crew, and they come together, and Ruth eats all that she needs, and when they're heading back out to the field, Boaz calls his work team together, and he says, guys, drop a little extra. Be a little more careless today. It's okay. I'm not going to fuss at you. Leave a little bit extra behind because this woman is doing such an awesome thing. So after a long day in the field, Ruth comes back. Naomi goes, my goodness, look at all this grain that you have. Okay, I'm not that excited when I was a kid, my mom would come back with a bag of flour, wasn't too pumped, right? You know, but when you're coming back and like, this is how you eat, is you actually got to get it from the field. You got to process it. You got to work it. You got to bake it. Like, to see all that come in meant we're going to survive here. The Lord has met our needs. And so Naomi discovers, like, how did this happen? Ruth said, well, I ended up in the field of this guy named Boaz, and he was really nice to me. And Naomi knows that Boaz is a relative of her husband. And she goes, you should stay in that field. You should keep working in that field. You should stay in that field until the end of harvest, but she doesn't tell her why. Okay? She works in there till the end of the harvest. She's there every day doing this. She's providing for her family. And we don't see a whole lot of interactions between Boaz and Ruth after that in the text. But it brings us to chapter 3, verse 1, where when the harvest season was ended, Naomi comes to Ruth with a suggestion. It says this, then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to Ruth, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may go well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, observe a place where he lies, then go, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say, I will do. Now, if I was Ruth, and I heard that plan, I'd be like, can you back up? You want me to do what? You want me to sneak up on him while he's sleeping and uncover his feet? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is not God's prescription for romance. If you're looking for a Christmas romance story, don't sneak into the guy or gal's bedroom and uncover their feet, right? You'll get arrested. That's a bad thing, okay? Let's not do that. What's happening here? This is not some Hallmark movie plan. This wouldn't work for Candace Cameron Bure. What's happening here is that they're planning a way for Ruth to take some initiative to get Boaz to take the next step. They've spent the entire harvest season together. And what we can pick up from the story is that Boaz is a good bit older than Ruth is. And that Boaz, looking at Ruth, would never go, it isn't there's any inappropriate age difference. What I'm saying is that Boaz would not go, I'm going to pursue that. I'm just going to keep providing for her. He was a bachelor. He apparently had never married, or he had lost his wife. The story really doesn't say. And so here is Ruth going to the threshing floor, which is where they would process the grain. They do it in the afternoon and evening when the winds would blow through. They toss it up in the air, and it would separate the wheat from the chaff. Is this processing thing, and then once it was all bagged, once it was all good, then the owner and some of his crew would stay at the threshing floor to protect it until morning, where they could take it and sell it and be able to deal with it. So Boaz lays down. He's sleeping. Ruth does exactly what Naomi told her to do. And so what is happening with this uncovering of the feet? Like, what's the story here? In essence, Ruth is taking the first step of saying, if you were to ask me to marry you, I would say yes. That's what's happening here. This is simplest way of understanding it is that this was a culturally appropriate way for her, as the widow, to be able to reach out to this unmarried man and say, if you were to ask me to marry you, you can know that I would say yes. That brings us to verse 8, where Ruth has followed every step of the plan. And at midnight, the man was startled. This is Boaz. And he turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Now, again, you can't view this through 21st century lens. If you submitted this as a script to Hallmark, it wouldn't get published. They already have their story. They're all set, right? So when Ruth follows Naomi's directions, when Boaz awakened, he startled. Ruth asked Boaz, in essence, like the words from the prayer he had offered for her earlier. The prayer Boaz had offered said, may the Lord cover you with his wings where you've come to find shelter. Ruth, in her saying, If you ask, I'll say yes. Ruth is saying, will you cover me with your wings? Will you provide for me a home and a family? Will you bring me into your home? Because I'm on my own right now culturally. And she uses this word. She says, you are a redeemer. Now, that's a word we use for Jesus. That's a word we use for what Jesus accomplished on the cross. But it's a word that would have made perfect sense to people who were living in this time and hearing this story. As a relative, Boaz was called a kinsman redeemer. Some of your translations may use that phrase, kinsman redeemer. Some even use the word avenger, which takes this story in a whole nother turn, right? But it actually, the thing is kinsman redeemer. And this kinsman redeemer was a relative who came to the rescue. This was a role within a family, and it was a prominent male member of the family who was the official guardian of the family's honor. That if you had somebody who had to sell family land, remember these people came from Egypt into the promised land, God gave them land to provide for them, and that land was divided up among 12 tribes. And that land was supposed to stay within that tribe, within that family, within that clan for all time. Supposed to be theirs. It was God's promised land to them. And so whenever somebody hit financial hardship, had to sell their land, the kinsman redeemer would often buy it back for them to keep it within the family. Whenever somebody had to sell someone into slavery, which is not an odd thing to happen, awful, but not unusual thing to happen in this time, the kinsman redeemer could come along and buy that person and redeem them out of slavery. You could also have, and this is going to seem odd to us, but it was part of God's plan that had been prescribed to his people for this time, is that that this kinsman redeemer, when someone died, when one of the males of the family died without an heir, you had this opportunity within God's law to allow a relative of the deceased husband to marry that widow and then provide descendants for the dead relative through that relationship. Now we go, that's just weird. I'm not recommending it, right? I'm not recommending it. But that was part of God's provision to keep the land and the inheritance within the family. That's what's happening here, all right? So Boaz is this kinsman redeemer, and it may seem odd to us, but from a biblical narrative perspective, the big story God is telling, Boaz is a living illustration of what Jesus does for his people. How so? John MacArthur describes it this way. Jesus is our true kinsman redeemer, who becomes our human brother, buys us back from our bondage to evil, redeems our lives from death, and ultimately returns to us everything we lost because of our sin. These ancient customs seem strange to us, but what they were doing is they were preparing God's people for the eventual work of Jesus on the cross and the empty tomb, that he would redeem them by becoming flesh, dying in their place, purchasing their freedom, paying their debts, and rescuing them and bringing them back from everything that's been broken. That's what's happening here. Look at verse 10. So Boaz said to Ruth, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. All right, cue the snowfall, cue the music. This is our Hallmark movie moment. I know it doesn't look like it, but this is our Hallmark movie moment. If you were an ancient reader of this story, this is where somebody, is going, I love this story, it's so good, right? Like this is the moment where this is coming through. This may seem strange to us, but in this moment, it is a beautiful picture of love and redemption being painted here in this ancient interaction. Boaz says, I will redeem you. You have done a kindness to me. You could have gone after much better looking younger guys, but you have done this kindness to pursue me. And you know what? I will redeem you. But there's always the complication, right? But there is someone who is closer to your husband and Naomi's family on the family tree than I am. They have first right to it. So the way the text reads is like first thing the next morning, like Boaz is sprinting to the town gate. Why? Because the town gate is where these things would be decided, is where these sort of disputes would be resolved. So like at sunup, Boaz is in a full sprint to the town gate because he loves Ruth too. And you can see that coming through in the text. He gets there, and he talks to the man who is closer to redeeming Ruth on the family tree than he is. And in talking to him, he says he does not lead with Ruth. He leads with the land that Ruth would be set to inherit if she's able to find marriage within the family, right? And the guy goes, yeah, love land, love to do it. Then he goes, but there's also a widow who comes with this deal as well. And he goes, I'm out. So Boaz goes, yes. He doesn't, okay? But there's this moment where he pumps his fist like, yes, right? That's what I was hoping for. And so in front of the town elders, Boaz quickly and joyfully committed to redeem Ruth. And Boaz embraced this outsider, this Moabite, who in every historical, cultural context had no hope of a future. He reaches out and he gives her a family and a home. Look at verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. They named him Obed. Ruth, at many points in this story, could have allowed her Moabite past to decide her future. She could have let the painful death of her spouse define her life. She could have allowed her outsider status to keep her on the sidelines, but Ruth trusted God to overcome her troubled past and to give her hope for the future. In spite of all the reasons that Ruth should have said, I'm just staying in Moab, I'll choose the familiar, she saw something in Naomi and wanted to know more about her God, and at every step she just kept doing the right thing, and God gave her hope and a future. He gave her a new life, he gave her a new husband, he gave her a new family. But I'd love for you to go, and they lived happily ever after, and that's the end of the story. And you know what? We'd love that story, and it's really, really good. But here's what I want us to catch. If this is where the story ends, it's just another Hallmark movie. If this is where the story ends, all we got was our happily ever after. We didn't get anything else. We see Ruth, the lonely person who finds love. Boaz, the lonely guy who finds his gal. We see Naomi, the lonely widow who becomes a grandma. There's this beautiful thing of her celebrating the birth of her grandchild. It's really, really cool to see. And we look at those happily ever after moments, and we watch a Hallmark movie. We watch another movie that we really enjoy, and we see the ending of that story, and we want our happily ever after. We want our story to come to resolution. We want all those broken pieces to be able to come together into something that makes total sense, and we want our happily ever after. We want our Hallmark ending, our rags to riches story, our underdog becomes the champion. We want our stories to look like the movies and the stories that we love. That's what we want. But here's my fear, is that we have settled for Hollywood stories when our lives are meant for so much more. We have settled for Hollywood stories where we want them to work out according to our plan, where God has meant our stories to be so much more. And I'm going to tell you, God's story is better than my story, but not because it makes total sense right now. In fact, there's many parts of my story that I'm still not understanding totally, but I'm trusting that one day when the story's all done, and one day when I see the author, that all the pieces will fall into place, or being blown away by his glory, I'll go, why did I ever spend 2 seconds thinking about that? If Ruth's story ended right here at this moment with the addition of Boaz and the addition of Obed, it'd be a sweet story, it'd be a touching story, it would be an encouraging story for anybody who's ever walked through any sort of pain, loss, uncertainty, trying to deal with something you never thought would come. Like, it would be great and it would be worthwhile, but would it be a reclamation project story? There's no repentance. There's no big, huge turning point. There's no, you were heading this direction and now you're kind of heading that direction. Like, life happened to Ruth, and she still pursued God that she saw in Naomi, and God did something amazing for her. So why is this sweet, encouraging, yet really ordinary story, why is it included in the Bible? We haven't even gotten to that part yet, and it's one of the very last lines of the entire book. Look back at verse 13 and 17. It says, she bore a son. They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Do you see it? Sometimes we look at our lives and we feel like Ruth, like nothing's going right, so there must be something wrong with us. Sometimes we look at our lives and we think, I've reached the low point. There's no way I can have a bright future with this being part of my story. But we can see in Ruth's story that the low point of her life was not the determining factor for her ultimate role in God's story. And it doesn't have to be the ultimate determining factor in our story either. We've all reached a point in our lives where we think this must be the bottom basement. You must not be able to go any deeper than we've gone right now. This must be rock bottom. And we go, and if this is my rock bottom, I may be able to get a little bit higher, but there's no way God's ever going to bring something great from this entire mess. But we see in Ruth's story that a love story that began in tragedy, that ends in a heartwarming love story moment, is really only important because it ends up being where Ruth becomes King David's great-grandmother, a Moabite, a widow, a stranger in a strange land. If we're casting God's story, we're not casting Ruth, are we? Oh, this person's going to be the great-grandmother of the king, the greatest king in Israel's history, right? This powerful figure, writer of the Psalms, right? This hero and conquering king, this warrior poet king. Like, we're not going to choose a Moabite. We're not going to choose this person who's had painful things in her life. We're not going to choose this stranger in a strange land. And yet, Ruth had not made a mess of her life, but life had certainly messed with her. And yet, in the midst of that story we would have never signed up for, let alone written for anybody else, she is this unique reclamation project. A story that reminds us that even when life hurts, when we're on the outside looking in, when what we are seeing in our lives does not make sense and doesn't feel like God can come back from that and do something with us, we can remember that God delights in using imperfect people to accomplish his perfect plan. And Ruth is not an outlier. It happens over and over and over again. We've seen it in Peter and Thomas, and we've seen it in Gideon and Jonah, and now we've seen it in a very different way, but we've seen it in Ruth as well. And you know what? It really only gets better from here, because if the story stopped at King David, we would go, wow, I didn't see that coming. Like the readers of this story would go, hold on, this person is an ancestor of King David. They go, wow, never saw that coming. But they had no idea what was coming, because we know that if she is an ancestor of King David, that also means that she is an ancestor of Jesus Christ, the King of Kings. And we see her listed in Matthew chapter 1 with 4 women's names listed in the genealogy of Jesus. And Matthew did not choose the people that had lived a perfect life, that it made perfect sense for them to be in there. He chose people like Ruth, who was a widow and an outsider and a Moabite, but she's part of Jesus' family tree. He chose people like Rahab, who had been a prostitute, but God had used her to protect the spies that went into Jericho when the people were coming to the promised land. Used Bathsheba, who had this whole messed up soap opera with King David that has lies and murder and ends up resulting in a baby that dies, but she ends up being the mother of King Solomon, and it moves on to this incredible, beautiful story, right? And when you have this woman called Tamar, I won't even go into her story, because if I don't tell you the whole thing, you're going to go, I don't know what to do with this story. Like Jerry Springer would have gone, I'm not touching this story, right? These 4 women's names are listed in the genealogy of Jesus, and it's one of the most beautiful things about the Bible is that the Bible included warts and all. Messed up people with messed up paths. God used him in their story, used them in his story, used her in his story. He used these people. We would have said, there's no way that can be good for God's big story. And God goes, you got it all wrong. It is in their weakness where my glory is proclaimed. The reason Ruth's reclamation project matters is because her life ultimately points to Jesus. And in her story, I hope you can see today that God cares about every aspect of your life. This was an ordinary story with ordinary interactions. And if you were reading through it, you would be waiting for, when's God going to show up? When's God going to speak? When's the miracle going to happen? Where's the parting of the Red Sea and the burning of the bush? Like, when is that going to happen? That's not this story. It is God being involved in things that are big, but really we see in Ruth that God's involved in things that are small. In big and small things, God sees all of it. The things that are important to us, but we can't let those things get in the way of what is ultimate to God. We can't let anything get in the way of Jesus. Ruth had no idea that this is where her story would go, but Ruth and her story is remembered because God uses small people in small ways to accomplish his big purpose. It's true in the book of Ruth, and it's true in your life as well. Even though Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, they speak of him, God doesn't speak once in this entire story. There's not one word from God. There's not one declaration of a prophet. There's not an angel who shows up. There's not even some big fish who comes through and swallows a guy. These are ordinary, everyday events. And yet, even though God doesn't speak in this book, his hand is on every page and every turn of events. He is totally and continuously in control of this story, and the same thing is true in your life and mine. Even though when we hear that reality, we also must admit that we often fail to perceive his hand at the wheel. And we also don't like the fact that he takes turns we never would take. God works in everyday moments to accomplish his eternal goals. And if we believe in a God who is sovereign, who holds the universe in the palm of his hand, and there's not a particle in all of creation that has gone rogue from him, then we can recognize that he's the author, and we are just parts of his story. We also got to recognize that the most important part of this story is that it ends in Jesus. The most important part of this story is that God uses an unlikely person to be a part of his perfect plan. But we also got to realize Ruth never saw King David born, let alone see the birth of the King of Kings. Ruth had no idea how her life would be used by God to accomplish his big plan. She didn't live to see any of it. So I leave you with this question. Will you trust God to make the most of your life, even if you never live to see its ultimate impact? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for your word and for your love. Lord, I thank you that in a world that sometimes feels like it's spinning out of control, we can know, we may not feel, but we can know that you are in control of all things. We don't understand everything you let through the filter of your hand, but we can trust the heart that holds us. We can trust the heart that loves us, that you know what you're doing. Lord, we look at the story of Ruth, and she's not a character we would have cast. We look at the story of Ruth, and it's not a story we would have told. It's a story that begins in tragedy and ends up pointing to Jesus. Lord, we look at the tragedies in our lives, and it doesn't always make sense. We feel like that reclamation project. We certainly have parts of our hearts that are the Peter moments, the Thomas moments, the Jonah moments, where we run far from God, where we want nothing to do with God, where we've wrecked everything ourselves. But we've also all walked through some sort of pain, some sort of loss, some sort of heartache that we never saw coming and we never would have signed up for. And sometimes in the depths of our despair, we wonder if you've forgotten about us. But Lord, I pray you would take this story today and the words that you've allowed me to share, Lord, clean them up in somebody's mind and put them all together to make sense so that we can all see that we serve a God who is control of the ordinary. We serve a God who knows the numbers of the hairs on our head, and he sees every tear that falls, and it says that you catch them in a bottle and you record them in your book. You are not a distant God who made the world and then disappeared to the fringe to watch it spin out of control. You are close enough to catch our tears. So, Lord, whatever somebody is facing this morning, whatever has caused them to go, God, I'm not sure you're there. God, I don't know if you're on my side. God, I don't know if you have my best in mind. Lord, let us look to the story of Ruth and see that you can work ordinary things to accomplish your eternal goals. You may not use us to give birth to kings. You may not use us to eventually lead to the birth of the King of Kings, but you can use us to make the King of Kings known to a world that is trapped in darkness. You can use us to tell the good news of the coming of the King on Christmas, but not limit that evangelism to the Christmas season. We be a people who can't keep the good news to ourselves, but we live to love enough to share it. Lord, I pray you've helped us see in these reclamation projects that these stories are our stories, and that the same God who used those imperfect people can love and save and use us. Help us respond to that. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, hey, Good Life family, one last time, thank you so much for joining us for today's online service. We are thankful to have you here. And before we sign off, I quickly want to remind you of how we can share life and connect together as a church family. If God's stirring something in your heart, or you want to know more about following Jesus or your next steps in light of today's message, we'd love if you'd reach out and email us at info@goodlifefl.com, or you can always visit our website, goodlifefl.com. In addition to that, you can connect with us throughout the week on social media We're on Facebook as well as Instagram. And other than that, church family, we're excited to be continuing in the songs of the season and the holidays and celebrating Christmas together. We want to make sure that you are invited to our Christmas Eve service, December 24th. Of course, we're going to be meeting outside at Good Life, and we'd love for you to join us for that. Other than that, we'll be right back here next Sunday, 9:30 and 11, in person, and 11 o'clock online. So until then, let's continue to love enough, share the good news, and share our life as well. We'll see you again next Sunday.